In 72 AD, the Roman general Lucius Flavius Silva arrived at the head of the 10th Legion at Masada. Comprising of roughly 9,000 legionaries and auxiliary troops, it must have been a daunting sight for the roughly 1,000 Jewish men, women, and children living in the fortress palace of Masada. These Jewish individuals were the Sicarii, a splinter group of Jewish Zealots and well-known opponents of Roman rule in Judea. These individuals represented the last organized resistance in the First Jewish-Roman War, which erupted in 66 AD due to conflicts with Roman taxation, wealth inequality within the Jewish population, interreligious strife with pagans, and a very controversial move by the Roman governor to seize money from the Jews' Second Temple in Jerusalem. Although Masada may be considered the end of the war, in fact, the Jews had effectively lost when General Titus, son of Emperor Vespasian, captured Jerusalem in 70 AD. The depopulation of the city of Jerusalem due to famine and death from the siege, as well as the destruction of the Second Temple, certainly ended most resistance except for those Jews living in Masada, who were defined by their fanatical resistance to Rome. There was a fortress of very great strength not far from Jerusalem, which had been built by our ancient kings, both as a repository for their effects and the hazards of war, and for the preservation of their bodies at the same time. It was called Masada. Those that were called Sicarii had taken possession of it formerly. The Jewish War by Flavius Josephus, 75 AD. How Masada fell to the Romans is of considerable debate. The only contemporaneous source is a book titled The Jewish War by Flavius Josephus, born Yosef ben Mattiyahu. Flavius Josephus, his Roman name, was a Jewish priest, governor, and general who was captured by the Romans early on in the war, and, as a captive, was present during much of the course of the Roman campaign. The nature in which Flavius Josephus fell into Roman captivity is suspicious, and to many Jews he represents a traitor to this very day. At the siege of Yodfat in Galilee, many of the Jewish defenders chose to commit suicide rather than being put to death or sold into slavery by the Romans. However, Josephus appears to have been one of the few to negotiate a surrender to none other than future Emperor Vespasian and his son Titus. Surrender to the Romans by a high-profile leader such as Josephus, when everyone else appears to have honorably committed suicide, must have been galling to the Jewish side. The fortress of Masada was originally constructed by the Jewish Hasmonean kings in the 1st century BC. It was later improved upon and converted into a hybrid palace fortress by none other than Herod the Great. The motivations for these improvements to this fortress in the middle of the Judean desert by Herod the Great may have been twofold. First, it helped deter territorial ambitions by the Egyptians. Second, it provided a refuge for Herod. Although a Jewish king, Herod was seen as a usurper by the Jewish population. He was not born in Judea, but rather in Idumea to an Idumean father and a Nabatean mother. Furthermore, he was seen as a puppet client king of Rome, capturing Jerusalem with the help of Roman forces lent to him by Mark Antony. Throughout his reign, he appeared to be concerned about uprising by his own Jewish population, which may have in turn led him to fortify or construct a number of palace fortresses like Masada throughout his kingdom. If one were to approach Masada from the east or from the Dead Sea side, one can't help but be awed by the height and considerable steepness of the terrain. The terrain here might suggest that the fortress was unassailable. However, on the western side of the fortress lies a low, flat hill. It is from this elevated and far less steep western approach that the Romans concentrated their efforts to take Masada. In true professional Roman military fashion, upon arriving at Masada, they immediately began construction on 3 notable landmarks. The Romans first constructed a series of camps visible on both the Dead Sea facing side and the opposite side facing west. The large rectangular encampments likely held the legionaries, and the smaller ones the auxiliaries to the legion. They also constructed a circumvallation wall around Masada to prevent anyone from entering or leaving it. Finally, on the western side of Masada, they began working on an attack ramp that quickly extended forward and upwards towards the walls of the fortress. Helpless to do much about this rapidly approaching earthen ramp, Flavius Josephus states that the decision by the Jewish defenders to end their lives was made. Josephus writes that as the defenders' supplies began to run low and the Roman attack ramp inched slowly closer to the walls of the fortress, the Jewish defenders decided to deprive their adversary of a victory, which would normally entail either their deaths or enslavement. Accordingly, all of the men took it upon themselves to kill their respective wives and children. After this, the men drew lots, and 10 men were selected to kill the other men. Lots were then drawn again, and 1 man was selected to kill the remaining 9. In this manner, no person save the very last man committed the sin of suicide, thereby not violating the Jewish law against it. A rather dramatic and perhaps befitting end to the First Roman-Jewish War, or so we are led to believe. This mass suicide reported by Josephus is the subject of considerable debate. Archaeological evidence does not support a mass suicide. Excavation of Masada in the 20th century did not reveal the remains of 1,000 skeletons. Remember, Masada is in the desert on the top of an isolated rock plateau. One would think that the skeletal remains of so many people would have to be in the vicinity and discoverable during an excavation. Furthermore, it would seem improbable that the Romans would somehow be inclined to cart off 1,000 bodies to be buried elsewhere, far from Masada. So why would Josephus fabricate a mass suicide? Despite being a Roman captive, or a collaborator depending on one's perspective, he was still Jewish. The mass suicide would have casted the Jewish defenders in a far more noble light. Also, would anyone past or present have cared about Masada if a mass suicide had not taken place? A Roman victory in a standard battle between a heavily reinforced legion and no more than 1,000 Jewish men, women, and children somehow seems anticlimactic to the end of the First Roman-Jewish War and simply not noteworthy. Like it or not, mass suicides catch the public's attention, which might be a great way to gain notoriety for Josephus's book. One might find it incredulous that Josephus could fabricate something so outrageous as a mass suicide. However, this was the first century. There was no internet or reporters to verify what happened on the edges of the Roman Empire. Ultimately, we'll probably never know the true fate of the Jewish defenders of Masada. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, subscribe, and check out my other videos on the Levant.